Hey there, ready to roll up our sleeves and dive into something kind of meaty today.
I'm always up for a challenge. What's on the docket?
Well, we're tackling restructuring. No, not the fun kind where you reorganize your bookshelf. We're talking about the kind that can shake up entire companies, industries, even entire economies.
I see we're going big picture today.
You got it. You sent over a really informative Wikipedia article on this really fascinating stuff. So we're going to break down what it all means, why it matters, and maybe uncover some real-world examples that might surprise you.
Sounds good. Restructuring is one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but the implications go way deeper than people realize.
Exactly. So how about we maybe think of a company as a giant, really complex machine with tons of moving parts. Restructuring then is kind of like hitting the reset button on that machine, but, and this is important, not in a way that breaks everything.
More like fine-tuning it, right?
Exactly. The Wikipedia article defines it as changing the legal, ownership, or operational structure of a company, usually to make it more profitable or just better organized.
Right, and it's really important to remember that restructuring is strategic. It's not just change for the sake of change. There's a method to the madness.
Okay, so it's more like hitting the refresh button with a specific goal in mind.
Exactly. Those goals could be anything from, boosting profits and increasing efficiency to adapting to, say, new markets or technologies.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, when people hear restructuring, they often think of, well, negative things, layoffs, downsizing, that sort of thing. And while that can definitely be part of it, it's not the whole picture, is it?
Not at all. Sometimes restructuring is actually about saving a company from going under, or at least positioning it for growth down the line.
It's like a financial fresh start, in a way. The Wikipedia article even mentions how restructuring can be used to help companies recover from bankruptcy.
Exactly. And this is where the human side of things comes into play.
Oh, absolutely. Because these decisions affect real people, their jobs, their livelihoods, their families.
Precisely. A successful restructuring, if there is such a thing, takes into account the needs of employees, customers, and even the communities where the company operates. It's a delicate balance.
Okay, so we've talked about why companies restructure, but what about the how? The article mentions things like mergers and acquisitions. How do those fit into the bigger picture?
So sometimes the best way for a company to achieve its goals, whatever those goals might be, is to join forces with another company. This can happen through a merger, where two companies basically combine into one.
Like a business marriage.
Yeah, you could say that. Or it could happen through an acquisition, where one company just takes over another one.
And the goal there is usually to, what, gain a larger market share, acquire new technologies maybe.
Right, or even just to streamline operations and reduce costs. It can be a lot of things.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's a whole issue of adapting to new trends or technologies that's huge these days.
Huge, and only getting bigger. Right. Everything's changing so fast now.
Exactly. Companies that fail to adapt risk getting left behind, and restructuring can allow them to kind of shift their focus, invest in new areas, and reinvent themselves.
So it's not just about fixing what's broken, it's about staying ahead of the curve.
Exactly. Now, speaking of challenges, the article mentions something called corporate debt restructuring, which, admittedly, sounds a little intimidating.
Yeah, little bit, not gonna lie.
It's actually simpler than it sounds. Imagine you're a company, and you've borrowed, say, a significant chunk of change. Corporate debt restructuring basically involves renegotiating the terms of those loans, maybe to get a lower interest rate, extend the repayment period, things like that.
So it's like refinancing your mortgage, but on a much larger scale.
Exactly. It's all about finding a solution that works for everyone involved.
Yeah.
And like any good negotiation, communication is key. The article really stresses the importance of transparency and open dialogue with creditors throughout the process.
Makes sense. You don't want any surprises when you're dealing with that much money.
Exactly.
Now, when a company is going through all these changes, sometimes massive changes, how do you even begin to put a price tag on it? Especially if it's, in a state of flux.
That's where valuations come in. It's a critical part of restructuring, especially in those more complex cases.
So valuations are basically like figuring out how much a company or parts of it are actually worth.
Exactly. And this isn't just about assigning some arbitrary number. It's about understanding a company's assets, its liabilities, future earning potential, all of it.
So it's not just about what the company is worth today, but what it could be worth down the line after all the restructuring is done.
Precisely. It's about assessing the potential, not just the present. And those valuations become critical tools for making decisions, whether it's about selling off assets, merging with another company, attracting new investors, you name it.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the article mentions something called the London approach to restructuring, which I gotta say sounds very official.
It does, doesn't it? It's more of a historical perspective on how restructuring used to be done, particularly in Europe. The London approach was known for being more conservative, more creditor-friendly.
So it was all about minimizing losses and keeping things stable, even if it meant maybe missing out on some bigger opportunities.
Yeah, you could say that.
But of course, the business world, like everything else, is constantly evolving. So how have things changed? What are we seeing in the restructuring world today?
Well, for one thing, the rise of private equity firms, hedge funds, and other alternative investors has really shaken things up.
Mm.
These investors are often much more willing to take risks and push for bolder, more innovative solutions. So things move a lot faster these days.
So it's a much faster paced, higher stakes environment than it used to be.
Exactly. It's a whole different ballgame now, that's for sure.
So walk me through some of these new strategies we're seeing in modern restructuring. What are the power moves these days?
Well, one increasingly common tactic is selling off assets that a company isn't really using, kind of like clearing out the clutter.
Okay, so what kind of clutter are we talking about here?
It could be anything from, say, real estate and equipment to patents and intellectual property stuff that's just sitting there, not really contributing to the core business.
So the idea is to find someone who can use those assets, someone who sees the value that maybe the current company isn't tapping into.
Precisely. It frees up capital for the company and allows those assets to actually go out and create value somewhere else. It's a win-win, ideally.
Makes sense. What else are we seeing out there?
Another big one is outsourcing. It tends to get a bad rap, but it's more nuanced than people realize.
Yeah, when people hear outsourcing, they usually think of jobs being sent overseas.
Right, and while that can be part of it, it's not the whole story. Outsourcing can also involve partnering with specialized firms, even within the same country or region.
So it's more about finding the most efficient way to get things done, whether that's in-house or by bringing in outside expertise.
Exactly. A company might outsource things like IT support, payroll, even parts of its manufacturing process.
So it's about delegating, strategically playing to your strengths, and letting the experts handle the rest.
Right. And it can be a smart move, but companies definitely need to be mindful of the potential downsides, like the impact on employee morale that's huge and how the public perceives it.
You don't want to save a buck only to have it cost you in the PR department later on.
Exactly.
Mm.
And speaking of PR, the article also talks about how crucial public relations is during a restructuring move. It's not just about making the changes behind closed doors, it's about communicating those changes effectively to the outside world.
Right, because perception is everything. If people don't understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, they're going to jump to their own conclusions, and those are rarely good.
Exactly. It's about managing those perceptions, addressing concerns head on, building trust with stakeholders, investors, customers, even the general public.
It's like if a company is going through this massive transformation, they need to bring people along on that journey, show them the method behind the madness.
Precisely. And that might involve, I don't know, press releases, media interviews, social media campaigns, community outreach, the whole 9 yards.
So transparency is key. Don't try to sugarcoat it. Just be upfront about what's happening and why.
Exactly. The more open and honest a company is, the more likely it is to get everyone on board with the changes. Now, we've talked a lot about the nuts and bolts of restructuring, but let's circle back to something we touched on earlier, the human element. Because it's easy to get caught up in the numbers.
Oh yeah, the balance sheets, the profit margins.
All of that. But at the end of the day, these decisions are affecting real people's lives.
Right, it's not just some theoretical exercise. It's about people's jobs, their careers, their families, their communities, their lives.
Exactly. And that's something I think about a lot, the ripple effects of these decisions. Closing down a factory might make perfect financial sense on paper, but what about the impact on the town where that factory is located?
It's like that saying, when you're up to your neck in alligators, it's hard to remember you came here to drain the swamp.
Right. You get so focused on one aspect of the problem that you lose sight of the bigger picture. And that's why I think it's so important to have these conversations, to really think critically about the human impact of restructuring, both on a personal level and a societal level.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've defined restructuring, talked about why companies do it, the different forms it can take. We even got into some of the ethical considerations. But before we wrap things up, I'm curious, from your perspective, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about restructuring? What do you wish more people understood about this whole process?
Oh, that's a good question. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that restructuring always equals failure. Like it's a last-ditch effort to save a sinking ship.
Right, like it's the beginning of the end.
Exactly. And while it's true that companies often restructure because they're facing challenges, it can also be a very proactive strategy, a way to position themselves for growth and innovation down the line.
So it's not necessarily a death knell. It can actually be a new beginning.
Exactly. Another misconception is that restructuring is a quick fix. People hear about a company restructuring and think, okay, that's it, it's all over. But in reality, it's often a very long, very complex process. It can take years to fully unfold, and there are no guarantees either.
Right. Even with the best intentions, the most well-thought-out planned things can still go sideways.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You've got economic conditions, market forces, competition, and then there's always the possibility of something totally unexpected happening, like a global pandemic, a natural disaster.
It's like trying to predict the weather, right? You can have all the data in the world, but there's always an element of unpredictability.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for companies to approach restructuring with a healthy dose of humility and adaptability. Things change, and you have to be able to roll with the punches.
So it's not just about having a plan A. It's about being prepared to switch to plan B, C, or D if you have to. You got to be able to roll with the punches, that's for sure. So for anyone listening who might be, a little apprehensive about their own company restructuring, maybe they're going through it right now, maybe they're just worried about the possibility, what advice would you give them? How can they navigate this whole thing with, I don't know, a little more clarity, a little more agency?
Well, first off, I'd say knowledge is power. The more you understand about what's happening, why it's happening, how it might affect you, the better equipped you'll be to deal with it.
So don't just sit back and wait for information to come to you. Be proactive, ask questions.
Exactly. Talk to your manager, talk to HR, do your own research, read industry publications, talk to people who've been through it before.
Get the inside scoop. And I imagine it's also important to, focus on what you can control, even when it feels like everything's totally out of your hands.
Absolutely. Update your resume, network like crazy, maybe even start exploring other opportunities just in case. You don't want to be caught off guard.
It's like that old saying, hope for the best, prepare for the worst.
Exactly. And hey, here's the thing. Restructuring can actually open up new doors. New roles might be created, new departments, even entirely new business units you never know.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There could be some really great opportunities that come out of it.
Exactly. Stay adaptable, stay open-minded, stay proactive, and you might just find yourself thriving in this new environment.
Restructuring. It's not just corporate jargon. It's a whole complex process with major implications for companies and the people who work for them.
It's a reminder that the business world is constantly in flux, and the more we understand about those forces driving change, the better equipped we'll be to navigate it all.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm feeling a sudden urge to do some restructuring of my own.
Oh yeah. What are we thinking? Total home makeover.
Maybe just that junk drawer in the kitchen that's been bugging me. Baby steps,
Hey, every little bit helps.
That's what I'm thinking. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and remember, change is inevitable, but growth is optional.